I rise today, Mr. President, to introduce a piece of legislation, one that is not just any old piece of legislation I might introduce. Probably this organization that I'm about to talk about had as much to do with the formation of who I am as a person today as my family did growing up. And I rise today to introduce the Peace Corps Improvement and Expansion Act of 2009. I point out that some 35 years ago, a young congressman from Massachusetts and an equally young congressman from Connecticut were elected to the United States House of Representatives, a fellow by the name of Paul Tsongas and myself. We were the first two former Peace Corps volunteers to be elected to the United States Congress. Paul Tsongas went on and was elected to the United States Senate, I think in 1978, no longer with us, died tragically a number of years ago. His wife, Nikki, is now a member of the House of Representatives from Massachusetts. Paul Tsongas and I were great friends and enjoyed sharing stories with each other for many years about our respective Peace Corps experiences. Paul Tsongas served in Ethiopia, one of the earliest programs, if not the earliest program in that country. I served in the Dominican Republic, beginning in 1966 through 1968, as a Peace Corps volunteer up in the mountains of that country, not far from the Haitian border. And the Peace Corps experience for me was as formative, as I said at the outset of these remarks, as almost anything else, more than anything else in my life, with the exception of my own family, growing up with wonderful 5 brothers and sisters in Connecticut, and in a family that was deeply involved in public service. But the Peace Corps experience was formative. And so over the years, I've expressed a great deal of interest in the organization and various administrations that have served in Washington since the late 1970s through the 1980s and 90s and the last decade, this decade we're in. So my interest in the organization is strong. The contribution of the Peace Corps has been remarkable, in my view, over the years. One of the few federal agencies that enjoys almost universal support from the American public. It has had greater moments of celebration and public awareness than at others, but it has been consistent in the minds of most Americans that this organization, which sends mostly younger Americans, but not always younger Americans, to serve in underprivileged nations, nations that are struggling, third and fourth world nations, to make a difference in the lives of others, has been a unique contribution of America to the world. There are many other voluntary organizations, some in our own country, some in other nations. But the Peace Corps holds a special place, I think, in the minds not only of our own fellow citizenry, but millions of people around the world who have come to know those Peace Corps volunteers, those mostly younger people, not always younger people, who served and spent 2 years working with them in their villages or urban areas, not only making a difference in their daily lives, but also getting to know them, getting to know us, people who would never have the chance to come to America, but got to know America because they met that young American who spent 2 years with them, learning their language, spending time with them, making a contribution to improve their lives. Well, for 48 years, the Peace Corps has stood as a uniquely American institution. I know other nations make contributions. This is not a unique idea for ourselves, but what other great nation would send its people abroad not to expend its power, not to intimidate its adversaries, not to kill or to be killed, but to build, to dig, to teach, to empower, and to ask for nothing in return? And for 48 years, those men and women, 180,000 of us, have returned, I believe, as stronger, wiser, and more inspired people, prepared to live our American lives of service. For half a century, the Peace Corps has shaped not just our lives, but the identity of all Americans, and what we hope to achieve, not only for our own nation, but for others who share this planet with us. Today, I rise to offer a piece of legislation for one simple reason, Mr. President. I want the Peace Corps to continue playing that role that it has for the last half-century, for another half-century to come. But before we consider how the Peace Corps can grow going forward, I think it might be worth remembering just how it came into being. Where did it all start? How was it created? Like an awful lot of groundbreaking ideas, Mr. President, the Peace Corps might not have survived a board meeting or a subcommittee hearing when the idea was first proposed. It was a wild notion in many ways, so breathtakingly outrageous that it could only have been born out of idealism, youthful energy, and perhaps a key element, too much caffeine. For you see, the Peace Corps was born at 2 o'clock in the morning. It was October 4th, 1960. A then young senator from Massachusetts by the name of John F. Kennedy was running for the presidency. And he was running hours late, as candidates are apt to do, for a campaign stop at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. John Kennedy assumed that most of the crowd would have gone home by that late hour, but when he arrived at the Student Union at the campus in Ann Arbor, he found 10,000 students waiting outside in the frigid dark to greet him. As public officials and holders of elective office, I think we can sympathize with that Senator Kennedy at that hour, having endured months of late nights on a campaign trail, uncomfortable beds, I suppose, and a bad diet along the way. I suspect he might have been sorely tempted at that late hour, as all of us have been from time to time, to offer a perfunctory thank you to the Michigan students for hanging around that long, recite that memorized stump speech at that point, having given it countless occasions from memory, and then send them on home and retire himself. But something besides a chill was in the air that night in Ann Arbor, Michigan. Bloodlit and shivering, the crowd began to chant his name as he climbed the steps to the Student Union. And Senator John Kennedy realized that this was something special. He realized that he owed these students more than just that perfunctory set of remarks. And so at 1:30 or 2 a.m. in the morning on a frigid night in Michigan, he challenged them as a candidate, as a United States Senator. How many of you, he asked, who are going to be doctors, are willing to spend your days in Ghana? Technicians or engineers? How many of you are willing to work in the Foreign Service and spend your lives traveling around the world, he went on. I believe, Mr. President, that challenge is the Peace Corps' founding document. It didn't begin with a white paper or a TV ad. It began with a simple question. In the days that followed the Kennedy rally at the Student Union in Michigan, students drafted a petition, circulating it to colleges all across that state and within a couple of weeks across the country, presenting several scrolls ultimately to John Fitzgerald Kennedy, containing thousands upon thousands and thousands of names. Letters, some 30,000, flooded his office, asking him to continue with this idea. So I think it's fair to say, Mr. President, the answer to that question, are you willing to serve your country by serving the world, was an overwhelming yes by a generation almost 50 years ago. Of course, several other pressing questions also follow. How do you build an organization around that raw energy? How do you pay for that? What do you even call that idea or organization? John Kennedy's top advisors were already working on those issues. After all, they had decided, if we don't start doing our part for the developing world, they were concerned, and rightfully so, that the communists would around the world. At a time much like today, when our nation faced conflicts with people who knew as little of America as we knew of them, this case for a Peace Corps could be made not only in the lofty rhetoric of idealism, but in the cold, hard language of realpolitik. The notion that service could be a part of our foreign policy, indeed, that it could be a powerful weapon in the Cold War, was truly a radical idea. It suggested that there could be more measures of strength than caliber or tonnage. It argued that the world needed to see our ideals, not just in ink, but incarnate in the person of Americans with dirty hands, working under a hot foreign sun. It said that you could not hate America if you know Americans. The skeptics quickly descended upon John Kennedy's idea. Richard Nixon called it Narcotics haven for draft dodgers, the Peace Corps. Even former President Dwight Eisenhower called it, quote, a juvenile experiment,